Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for that warm welcome, and thank you for that wet welcome from outside. We're part of the sort of spies at lunchtime sessions in the conference. I want to make it clear at the beginning, we don't choose the titles of these sessions. The Kremlin is everywhere. The titles are chosen by the wonderful organizers of the conference. They like to be known as the Politburo. No, they do, actually. So we have that title, The Kremlin is Everywhere. We're going to explore it, but we're also going to interrogate it. We're going to see if we think it's valid or not, and you will contribute to that at the end, we hope, with questions and answers. Then we will tell the Politburo what the conclusion is. So anyway, that's the general idea. We've got a very informed and also diverse panelists here who are going to look at it from very different perspectives, but all specialists on these kind of issues. So Robert Service, if I start over there, Robert Service is one of the most distinguished historians of Russia over the 20th century and into the 21st century, written about Stalin, Trotsky, Lenin, and so on, and has a new book coming out on Thursday called Kremlin Winter, Russia and the Second Coming of Vladimir Putin. It's coming out on Thursday, but thanks to the wonderful John Sandow bookshop, you can buy a copy now, and he will be giving you some sneak previews about what is in that book. Dr. Elisabeth Schimpfossl is a sociologist who works particularly on Russia's new bourgeoisie, the oligarchs, where they've got their wealth, how they've developed their position in Russia. And her book is They're Rich Russians from Oligarchs to Bourgeoisie. And a familiar face, a familiar voice to many of you, Gordon Corera, security correspondent of the BBC. Has written on many things, MI6, on computers, espionage, and so on, is working at the moment on a book about Russia and espionage and security issues and cyber warfare. And again, you'll be getting some sense of the things that matter to him. And I'm not a proper Russianist. I'm sort of an interest in international relations. My name's David Reynolds. But I did a book last year which was called The Kremlin Letters, about Stalin's wartime correspondence with Churchill and Roosevelt. So I've got an interest in the Kremlin from that side of things. So let's get down to business. And we want to try and get a sense of where Russia is now and where it's coming from. Bob, you've worked on the end of the Cold War. You've now worked on the Putin era. Soviet Union collapses in Christmas 1991. 1990s, terrible time for Russian people. Vladimir Putin comes to power in 2000. He's president, elected again in 2004. In 2008, he does a job swap with Dmitry Medvedev, his prime minister. And then the second coming is 2012. He comes back to the presidency. Now, when you use that term second coming, are you sort of saying that this is a new Putin? Was there an old, nice Mr. Putin, now there's a nasty Mr. Putin? Or how do you see this story, and what's the significance of 2012 for you as you see Russia developing?
I think that when Putin came back to power, properly to power, in 2012, he reconfirmed the direction he was going in before he gave the presidency to his protege Medvedev 4 years before. And I think that although it's important to look at who is president, it's even more important to look at the whole elite, the Putin administration, the so-called oligarchs around him, the administrators, the FSB, the secret police, and so on. And I think that by 1999, before Putin became president, there was already an emergent consensus in the Russian elite that things had gone badly wrong. Russia had become undignified. Russians could not hold their head up in the world, and that whoever took over the presidency, and it wasn't an accident that Putin was chosen because he agreed with this resentment, had to restore Russian pride. Formula One, the FIFA World Cup, or the Winter Olympics in Sochi, making Russians feel good about themselves again. Yeltsin had tried to do that, but things were against him, especially the oil price on world markets was against him. Putin was one of the luckiest presidents in Russian history. This elite said to themselves, we are going to make sure that some of the revenues, a lot of the revenues that flow from our possession of nickel, diamonds, but especially oil and gas, are going to flow into the treasury. And we are going to do something then to make Russia a great power again.
Make Russia great.
Make Russia great, yeah. They use the word velikaya very, very often without the Trump slogan. And they wanted control for a market economy. They were not communists. It's so often the case that media reports talk about Putin as if he were a communist. He has a very, very complex attitude to Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev. In fact, the only communist he hasn't got a complex relationship with was the founder of the Russian state, Lenin. He has never said a good thing about Lenin. That tells you a lot of what you need to know. Putin is a capitalist. He's in favor of the market economy, but he uses a lot of the old techniques and he uses a lot of the old institutions. And he is not interested in democracy except as a sort of fig leaf for his politics. So my view is that this system was coming into realization between 2000 and 2008, initially through a collaboration with America. This started to break down in the middle of the 2000s, and during the Medvedev presidency, to Putin's horror, he was at the time the premier, not the president, deals were done between Russia and the Western powers over Libya and the Middle East, which annoyed, irritated, and appalled Putin. So when he came back to power in 2012, he wanted a fiercer, more anti-American attitude than ever before. And when Ukraine started breaking out into revolution in 2014, he had no doubts about what needed to be done.
Okay, well, we'll come on to that in a moment. But I mean, if I pick up on the very interesting point you make about, you know, in a sense, Putin is obviously a strong man, but he's reflective of a more general mood in an elite and a society. Elisabeth, you've done a lot of work on your book, Rich Russians, on this elite. How do you understand the Russian elite, the wealthy, people you call, I think, the bourgeoisie? What is your take on how that society at the top has developed over the last 20 years?
It's developed from what I call a path from oligarchs to bourgeoisie. With bourgeoisie, I mean a social class that people who've cared about to legitimize themselves, to stabilize their social position, and to be able to pass it on to their offspring, make sure they will occupy similar status in society, which is very different from our general idea about rich Russians, especially when we think of all the conspicuous consumption and everything around it, which, as many interviewees, and that's important here, I started my research, as the academics do. I envy so many people in this room who managed to write their books in 1 year or 2. It's taken me 10. So I started my research in 2008. First interviews, the last interviews I did was in 2017. But by the time of 2008, thanks to the long oil boom and also this new wealth, not only Putin was a beneficiary of the oil boom, also many, many rich people, they've already gone through their phase, how they set themselves of how exciting it was at first when you have big money, you buy these toys, yachts, private jets, and so on. But after a while, it gets boring, and you get older, and you think maybe also about what you leave behind after your own life, and then you start caring about searching for something that has more sense in life. Typical example: Mahmoud, who bought Waterstones in 2011, he had to sell it again. He was very famous for his grand parties on his yachts in the south of France in the 2000s, during the oil boom. Then when he bought Waterstones, it started all being about books, getting children go back to reading books, hard copies, proper books. And also his kind of around that, he was building up a certain image about being cultured, being from an intelligentsia family. In about 1 minute when you talk to him, you will learn that his father was a law professor. He taught a lot also at Vienna University. I'm from Austria. And at home, they had a big library, which was the kind of one thing how Soviet people could distinguish themselves further, to have a well-sorted, sophisticated library. And they had all this. So a very, very different shift in narrative and lifestyle. Very important around that, of course, is also engaging in philanthropy, caring about the country and its future, at least in their projects and in words, less so in terms of where they save their assets. And also trying to find a certain past and ancestry in, also to understand themselves of not having come about just from nowhere, and building up this myth around them that they were born in the intelligentsia and their kind of cultural, moral leadership.
So they have a kind of legitimacy that takes them back into the Soviet era and before that as well, or?
Some, but most of them, in fact, many of them, by far the majority, were actually born into the Soviet intelligentsia. Some have family histories that goes far back into the past, but many fall into this category of the new intelligentsia that was born under Stalin in the 1930s and then got bigger.
And they were happy to talk to you? Was it difficult to make these contacts and get them talking?
Yes. That's probably one reason why it's taken me a little.
But are they actually people who now want to explain themselves and create this narrative that they want them to spread? Is that part of why they were willing to talk to you?
Very, very much so, yeah. Very much so. It was very different, so because there were nearly 10 years in between. The first time when I started in 2008, it was all much more informal. So I would go around and ask all kind of people whether they knew anybody who might introduce me to someone and so on. And there were the strangest stories. You could feel how, nevertheless, society has turned upside down in many ways. People knew, who were quite impoverished, but they knew from university times someone, and in that way I managed to get interviews. Then also one journalist, Austrian journalist, once he realized I had some phone numbers, we started trading them, and he gave me private mobile phone numbers of a number of oligarchs. And back then I was then cold calling them, which was very odd, but not completely, back in 2008, not completely unacceptable. I remember calling David Yakubashvili, you might have heard of him, for example, just on the phone, a cold call. That's changed a lot. So when I did my recent interviews, I wrote formal letters to their offices.
Right. Okay, well that's fascinating. We'll come back to that. So Gordon, I mean, you have been covering these kinds of issues for a long time. Robert Service was talking about in 2012 and about Crimea and so on. I mean, is there a sense for you of a certain turning point in terms of Putin's a more hostile engagement with the West? Was it because he felt that the Americans had somehow intervened in the 2012 election? Was it to do with Ukraine and so on? Where does all this come from?
So I think two broad points. One is spies matter, and the second one is spying has changed. And I think this will get to the answer to your question. Spies matter in that relationship between Russia and the West because it's defined the way the two sides have seen each other.
Yeah.
Specific actions have clearly dominated relations. Actions taken by spies. You can think of the Skripal poisoning, Litvinenko, Russia's interference in the US presidential election, but also Russia's perceived view that the West has interfered in its elections, even in the collapse of the Soviet Union itself, as having been partly something engineered by Western spies. And it matters because Putin himself is a KGB officer who grew up in that period.
That's surely very important.
It's very important. He was in East Germany as it collapsed.
Dresden,
he was there. He watched the failure to confront the crowds. He burnt papers from the KGB office personally in a furnace. He knows what it's like. And he has that conspiratorial mindset, I think, which sees the hand of the West involved in things. And I think that's strengthened over time. So there is a sense in which that view that he has shaped the way he sees relationships with the West, a conspiratorial mindset. And he has used spies. He's set his out there with instructions to go forth, and I think that's been in different phases. He's used the fear of spies at home to try and cohere Russian society. But I think the temptation to say, well, it's just a new Cold War is wrong, because I think that's where the spying has changed point comes in. If you look at the way Russia is able to carry out intelligence operations and influence and spy now, it's different. And I think one of the major differences is precisely the stuff we've just heard from Elisabeth, which is the fact that there's many more routes for influence in the West, and there's many more than you had in the Cold War. You had these two blocks which were largely isolated from each other. Now you have Russians in the West who have potential for influence through that, influence, sometimes espionage. You also have the cyber domain, and you have the ability to intervene at distance and use cyberspace to hack machines to carry out espionage, or to spread information, disinformation, misinformation, to try and shape things like the American election. So the ability to do things, to carry out intelligence operations, the ways, the mechanisms you can do that have changed profoundly. And I think Russia has been adept at mastering some of those new technologies. We heard it in the first session from General Petraeus, General Carter, about hybrid warfare. And I think they've been much faster than the West in understanding these techniques. They fit much more with their mindset, with a kind of spy's mindset in charge. And I think the West has been slow to understand and to respond to those issues. And I think, just finally answering your question, I think it's been, I think Robert's point is an important one, that there is Putin does change after 2012. And I think after 2014 particularly, you can see the intelligence services unleashed even more than we saw before. But partly in response to what he sees and what many in Moscow see as Western interference in Russia. And I think that's an important point.
I mean, what would be your perception of that perception? Well, I mean, it's presumably going on both ways, isn't it?
I think it is. I think the interesting thing is you get protests at the end of 2011 in Moscow against the idea of Putin returning and about rigged elections. And the question, Putin and some of those around him view that as having been the result of Western interference in their political process, as subversion.
And particularly the State Department and Hillary Clinton.
And Hillary Clinton actually says some kind of relatively, what seem to us quite anodyne comments, but which in Moscow are interpreted as almost like a signal to protesters that they have the support of the West, that they should be overthrowing. So they just see this hidden hand of the West involved in subversion. I think that that plays into the KGB mindset I mentioned, and it then justifies, in their minds, the response of interfering in the West.
Bob, what's your take on that? You agree? Or?
I think Gordon's onto something. I think reflects on something else that's very important. Russia is not a totalitarian society. It's not even a totalitarian state. It's much more ramshackle, much more chaotic. Putin can do some things, he can control some things. I'm very struck by a study that was done of the number of presidential decrees that were actually implemented. It was 60%.
In the Putin era, we're talking about?
Under Putin,
right,
as president. It was 60%. In other words, his minions see fit in 40% of cases not to do what Mr. Putin says.
So we're not talking about the legislature, it's simply about whether the functionaries are actually implementing what the president has decreed.
Legislature is more or less tame, but the executive in Moscow can't rule. We're talking about a country that is 1/9 of the world's Earth surface. It's a huge...
Was it 8 time zones, is it?
Is it 8 or 10?
Okay, well, a lot.
It's a lot of time zones.
A bit more than the UK, anyway. So yes.
At the moment.
yes. Okay, right.
We said
we said we're not going to talk about Brexit. Okay, stop. Right.
So it's not a totalitarian
it's not. No.
dictatorship. And what Gordon's talking about, the influence of the Western media, is the price that Putin has to pay for trying to turn his economy into a more dynamic one than it presently is, because he and his predecessor Medvedev, and indeed Boris Yeltsin, appreciate that if Russia is to be a truly global power again, it has to become a truly technological power. And it's a power of that sort mainly in the military and espionage sectors. But China, if we compare it with China, China is a general technological power, and that's where real superpower status is going to come from in the 21st century. And at the moment, Russia is weak. So that's one of the reasons why the world that Gordon is talking about is so prominent in the public politics of Russia, because this is one of the cheapest, easiest ways of exerting global power without being a truly superpower state. Russia is not yet at that level. So in some ways, Putin and the elite are threatening, menacing, interfering. In other ways, they are vulnerable to Western rock music, Western liberal values, everything that would undermine their power in Russia. And the thing that ultimately these Russian patriots are most interested in is the maintenance of their collective power over Russia.
So this is the paradox of Russia becoming, as it were, trying to become a capitalist state, is that it actually means that it is both, has more opportunities, but is also more vulnerable to the West, because it's a country which, as you say, contrary to China, has not really developed from that fundamental oil, energy-related economy that has always been its base. So, Elisabeth, I mean, this is, thinking about the sociology of Russia more generally. I mean, this is, Bob said that it's, reminds us of such size and so on. I mean, there is a big discrepancy, isn't there, between urban Russia and rural Russia? I mean, if you, as tourists, we visit Moscow, St. Petersburg, and so on, and, you could think that these are very Western kind of cities and societies. That's not, it's a very different story in rural Russia, isn't that right?
Yes, social inequality in Russia has risen massively. It's one, not if you look at income inequality, but at wealth inequality, one of the most unequal countries in the world. And that is a lot down to the differences between rural Russia and urban Russia. One thing I wanted to say about this election meddlings, I wouldn't I think it's often, we do the Kremlin a great favor by talking so much about it, and also by giving the Russians so much power and ascribing to them all this competence, which they don't have, and they know it. But for them, for Putin, it's a home play. The hysteria around the US elections is just perfect for him to show his own people, look what we achieve in those countries. And after all, we're just giving back because they interfered in our politics around the protests. So I wouldn't give them too much. And in terms of the value, that's interesting what you said, all kind of liberal values coming into the country. In terms of the rich, there's a certain specificity, I'd say, especially when it comes to the youth. Many people have the idea that the rich kids who get educated in Western schools and universities will then go home, bring along ideas of a rule of law and democracy and change around the country. I've spoken to more and more of them, and they clearly say they have all the kind of Western ideas, political correctness. They are not homophobic, they are not xenophobic, they know exactly the right speech around the modern everything up to date. But they all say, of course, they're in favor of Putin. Many of them, in their whole lifetime, they have never seen anybody else than Putin. And what they know exactly is that Putin has provided an environment that allowed their parents to become and remain super rich. So the last thing they want is any great turbulences, democracy or whatever that brings things, or kind of brings things that might endanger their own wealth. It's just not in their interest.
But rich kids what go to British public schools are one thing, but pensioners who are not getting the same value for their pensions,
and he's changed the pension laws dramatically, hasn't he?
are a threat. And Western media that say, stand up for yourselves. We live in free countries. We can form unions, we can go on marches, we can organize protests. That's where the threat, I think, is to Vladimir Putin, and that's why he doesn't like the Western media. I think you're absolutely right, Elisabeth, that he's got it cornered with the elite and the next generation of the elite. But pensioners blocked roads. They boarded lorries, they jumped on buses, they stopped hundreds of miles of Russian intercity thoroughfares last year. And this year, a lot of young people who did not go to private schools in Britain but are stuck in Russia went out onto the streets in Moscow and said, give us free elections only for Moscow City Council, not for the presidency. They weren't asking a lot, and the police went in with clubs.
Well, we'll come on to sort of, as it were, the future of the Putin era towards the end. But, I mean, Gordon, if we pick up on Elisabeth's point, you know, that we shouldn't exaggerate the impact that the Kremlin has. It's sensational and all the rest of it. I mean, what is your take on, for example, the huge amount of concern that the British government, Theresa May, had, about the Skripal poisoning and so on? I mean, what's your take on all that, really?
Well, I think trying to calibrate how we see Russia, I think, is really hard. And I think, as a member of the media myself, I think, I can be critical and say you occasionally see the portrayal swing from they are this ruthless, all-powerful, the Kremlin is everywhere, able to do everything. And on the other hand, you sometimes get, well, they're a bunch of clowns, who couldn't,
who say they just
who came to Salisbury to see the cathedral spire.
Yes,
and of course, the reality is somewhere in between.
Yes.
And the reality is, I think they are very aggressive in intent, but not always as capable as we might portray. And I think, back to Robert's point earlier, partly it's because it's not actually that coherent as a state. So partly you've got different intelligence services competing to do things and to show favour to the Kremlin, we think the Kremlin wants this, we are going to try and deliver it,
Yes.
and sometimes going too far or not doing it very effectively, which is potentially one thing that happened with Skripal, which is an example of a very aggressive intent,
Yes.
very aggressive, but not always as capable in execution as you might think. And I think also with the election interference, again, I think you have to just, getting the perspective right on it in the US is important. Huge amount of activity on Facebook and Twitter. How much difference did it make? It is very hard to measure what changed people's votes. I mean, it's very hard. Any kind of sociologist or political scientist will tell you it's very hard to measure why people vote, why they change their mind, and to be able to say, well, that swung the election, it's very, very hard to do so.
There's really no hard evidence for that claim, really, is there?
There is the leaking of things through the internet, some of the democratic material, I think, made some greater difference, and there's some evidence of that. So again, it's trying to get that calibration right about how to see Russia and the threat from its intelligence service in the state. I think is quite difficult, and I think we have to think about it quite hard rather than rush to either extreme.
So if we talk more generally about this whole sort of cyber warfare, which is in a sense what you were saying about spying has changed, I mean, that is a really significant change, isn't it? And also a significant way in which international relations are playing out now.
I think it's a particularly powerful tool, and it's one which Russia has mastered ahead of others. And in different ways, they've mastered the ability to do information warfare, which is a form of hybrid warfare, which is getting hold of information and then releasing it, which is damaging to the other side. So Democratic Party material in the US, but also you've seen it with telephone calls from American diplomats in the Ukraine criticizing European counterparts, intercepted and then leaked. So the ability to kind of cause trouble or mischief through a form of intelligence, overt as well as covert activity, blending them together in an interesting way. Russia has been at the leading edge of that and is less constrained, if you like, by Western traditions of seeing the military doing one thing, the intelligence services doing other things, less constrained by Western legal systems in doing this. So I think they've been willing to push the boat out, and in aggressive cyber warfare, they've tested things like turning off power stations in Ukraine. They took out a French TV station in 2015, almost as a test to see if they could take down a TV station. And literally, I mean, I went there and afterwards, and the Director General told me the screens went blank, one evening, just literally everything turned off. You can imagine as a BBC journalist, you kind of shiver goes down your spine when you hear about that. But they've road tested some of these capabilities. So they are at the aggressive end of being able to use these new techniques of cyber warfare, cyber intelligence, hybrid warfare.
And but I mean, Western intelligence agencies are doing the same sort of thing. Are they, the Western ones, less advanced? Are they more constrained by legal and whatever, restraints and so on?
I think they have some of the capabilities, and there's no doubt that the US has very high-end cyber capabilities. I mean, the one thing to say is the US was the first to actually carry out a destructive attack with Israel against Iran on their nuclear program, the Stuxnet virus. That was the first actual destructive cyber attack before the Russians did things in Ukraine. So we shouldn't pretend that there isn't the capability in the West, but it's not been led off the leash in quite the same way as the Russians have been road testing it. And I think conflicts in Ukraine, in Syria, have allowed the Russians to try things and to do things in a way that I don't think we've done, and we're still struggling to work out how to counter that and to combat it in this space between, and we heard this in the first session this morning, there is this new space where it's between war and peace. It's no longer a binary, you're at war, you're not at war. There is conflict going on in cyberspace continually. Quite how we adapt our legal systems, which are quite binary in terms of being at war and different standards apply, as well as the way the military and the intelligence services work. I think that's been we've been catching up on that.
Well, let's start thinking about the future. Elisabeth, one of the things you say in your book is that these are people who are looking to the future and have worked out ways they think of being able to carry on their wealth and pass it on and so on. I mean, what is your view of this Russian bourgeoisie and where it's going in the future?
I think it will take a very pragmatic position in between the different, the Siloviki and the Westernizer who are fighting their big fights and will also try hard not to fall under any sanctions, personal sanction, which is the most painful for them. I think by and large they are pretty safe, which we can see in data that shows that in comparison to other G7 countries, the billionaires in other countries were much more likely not to stay billionaires in contrast to Russia and under the Putin regime. So even though Putin has lashed out against a few, once you're a billionaire in Russia, you're pretty in a pretty good position. And for example, when it comes to the sanction last year, Bloomberg then recently published figures. The 10 richest Russians made much, much more extra wealth than any 10 rich people of any country in the world. So they've been doing pretty fine.
Well. Yeah.
Having said that, I've got more and more of my interviewees. One is sitting in jail, Magomedov. He's waiting for his trial. So he's arrested. He's waiting for his trial. And he's been waiting for his trial already 1.5 years. And if he's unlucky, he might spend 20 years in some gulag-type prison in Siberia. And others have meanwhile fled Russia. Ironically, one billionaire who proudly proclaimed that once you've made good money, you can't be running a business anymore. You need to retire and do something different and pass on the business to either good managers or, in his case, his sons. And he instead set up. He opened a museum in Moscow, and shortly afterwards he had to come to London. And London is another aspect here, which of course very crucial for what will happen with the Russian elite. So far, London's been so important to them. For example, they, in terms of litigation, of coming here, not being extradited, coming here and use all the infrastructure of schools, universities, being only 3.5 hours away from Moscow, and being able to set up a new business without much bureaucracy, very different to many other European countries, and so on and so forth. So after the Skripal poisoning, when there was talk about new sanctions, which we're still waiting for, then they got a bit nervous, because losing that, of course, would narrow their leeway quite a lot of how to live their life. Even, for example, they weren't particularly bothered about any rule of law in Russia, because even Putin's cronies would come to London to fight out their fights, which is just so part of their day-to-day life that would be. Personal sanctions from Britain would be quite a game changer.
Right, good. So, I mean, if we think about the politics, Robert Service now, the next election for Putin is 2024. How long is this man going on for? Is there serious political opposition? Could he ever retire because he has to, in a sense, protect his backside the whole time? What's your sense of where the Putin government, or Putin himself, is going?
Well, if you look at the history of rulership in the 20th century, it's a very difficult thing to do, to retire peacefully and in the hope that your successor will treat you and your legacy well. I mean, if you think of Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, they've all been traduced reputationally after they left power, either through retirement or death. Putin was chosen by Yeltsin for a number of reasons, because he was a toughie, because he was the progeny of the FSB, but also because
the security services,
the security services, but also because he was known to be a very loyal subordinate to the other people that he'd worked for in the past. So Yeltsin felt that his family would be all right after he left. Is there anyone else in the Kremlin elite at the moment that Putin can feel he's going to maintain my policy orientation and he's not going to touch my money?
Or myself.
And it's an open question. Probably the only person who knows the answer to that is Putin.
Yes. Yeah.
And the thing that has to be borne in mind about this future is not just Russia and the West, and not just what's going on inside Russia, but it's also Russia and China.
Yeah.
And so many of the analyses of what's going on in world affairs today in Western media has to do with Russia and the West. But Russia has always had an Eastern dimension. Yeah. It's a Eurasian power. And by abandoning the possibilities of collaboration with America for, in many cases, understandable reasons, Russia has rushed into an embrace with the Chinese, where the bargaining cards are always going to be in the hands of Beijing, because Washington has been abandoned.
Yeah.
Now, this is a really cardinal feature.
As in the development of the Arctic, for example, the amount of Chinese money that's helping Russia develop the Arctic opportunities.
And if you talk to Russian public figures about the future that you're asking about, David, publicly they will say absolutely nothing about China except positive things, because that's the official line of the day. But privately, as was the case when I was a student there in the 70s in Leningrad, through the 80s and 90s, they're terrified of the potential of China. And they have more reason to fear China now than they did in the 1970s.
A much more developed country, much more populous and all the rest of it. And of course, on 1st of October next week, the Chinese government will celebrate the 70th anniversary of of Mao's coming to power, Chinese Communist Party in power. Big military parade, big sense of China, making China great again, which is part of Xi Jinping's philosophy. I mean, so Gordon, I mean, and all of you in a sense, I mean, the Kremlin is everywhere. Should we be more concerned about China, both as a threat, but also as a power that we need to come to terms with, to work with, to understand, than Putin's Russia?
I think if you talk to national security folk, both here in the UK and in America, they will say that one of their concerns over the last few years is that the noise about Russia has distracted from the much bigger strategic challenge, which is China, and how to deal with that. And that they've only, you've seen it in America much more in the last year, shift towards thinking we mustn't get distracted by Russia to not see the importance of China. And again, but the challenges are different. They are not the same. They're not the same country. It's not a new Cold War with China, just as it was with Russia. The economic entanglements are different. Yeah. The ability to separate out supply chains and technology is much more challenging. How you deal with a company like Huawei is a really complicated issue, where national security meets prosperity. There are really complicated issues in national security.
And here is a country also that has China that has an economic and geopolitical strategy, the One Belt One Road project, which is designated to take them to 2050.
Yeah, and
compared with US, where you don't know where you are week from week. This country where you don't know where you are from day to day, but anyway, we won't talk about that. But I mean, that is a hugely important thing. So yeah,
I think
we need to open up for questions, but just quickly.
You raise an important point there. Where does the Belt and Road Initiative go? It goes right through ex-Soviet Central Asia.
Yes.
And who is likely to be annoyed by that?
Yes. Yeah. Good. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I mean, we've got a lot of ideas there. I'm sure there are things you want to argue about and question about. But split up your hands, but please don't talk till your microphone comes your way. There's a gentleman here who's got his hand up.
Yeah, hi. I was actually working in Russia when the Ukraine crisis happened, and a lot of my Russian partners actually felt that, look, the sanctions are not going to work. Now, looking back for the past 3 to 4 years, period of low oil price, they've survived. Do you think the sanctions have worked? And should they continue, drop, or increase?
Anybody want to answer that? Yeah.
I on balance feel that sanctions were necessary. As soon as you met a Finn, an Estonian, a Latvian, a Lithuanian, a Pole, a sensible Hungarian. I'm thinking of the ruling
yes.
elite that they have at the moment. Then it was obvious that there was a fear of the expansion of Russian imperial instincts again. So I think a marker had to be laid down regarding Crimea. Russians do feel, this is a genuine Russian popular feeling, that Crimea is theirs.
Yes, yeah.
They have no sense that once it was in the condominium of the Ottomans, that they conquered it only in the 18th century. It hasn't always been Russian, but it is true that borders between one Soviet republic and another were drawn and then redrawn dozens and dozens of times in the period of the USSR. So Russians have this idea that somehow it's not just Putin, it's not just the administration. There is this feeling of Russian national patriotism, which has been stoked up by Vladimir Putin. But it has to be faced down, I think. They are meddling in our politics. We can't meddle in their politics in the same way. What's the point? We know who's going to win the next election always.
Right, so let's take another question. There's a gentleman there. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. This is a question particularly for Elisabeth. Can you generalize as to how the rich Russians became rich?
There were different phases. So the 1990s, the most notorious ones were through privatizations and voucher privatizations, and then later the big ones of big state assets. In the 2000s, it was all this big group coming up thanks to the high oil prices, and that was also diversification of the economy. So when you have a lot of resource-based, up to now, of course, wealth that was then spreading out to more finance and all kind of other areas in the 2000s.
Good, thank you. Another question? Okay, I'll take you in a moment. The lady there, that's right. Okay.
Yes, I just came back from the country of Georgia, which 20% of its geographical area is now controlled by Russia, and there are continuing advances into different villages in that country. And we haven't talked about Georgia, but the big concern there is really, obviously, NATO is not letting them in because of the geopolitical situation and the antagonism toward Putin that would engender. But what is going to stop, and who is going to stop this continued advance into Georgia and into the Ukraine? I mean, it just seems like the Russians know that no one's going to step up.
Okay. So it's a question really about that near abroad that was part of the Soviet sphere and the Russian empire.
Well, I suppose the this goes to the earlier point of sanctions. What's the effect of sanctions? If the question is, are sanctions only effective if they reverse their policy in Ukraine and Crimea, then it's not been effective. But hopefully it establishes a deterrent effect towards going too far in places like Georgia. And I think sanctions, particularly against targeted individuals, do matter in Russia, and if they fear that it will have an impact, it might. But it is this Russian view of the near abroad that it has, which is that this is, in its view, a buffer state. These are buffer states historically. Back to the Second World War, it would have viewed it against the West, and it doesn't like not having control of them. It didn't like NATO expansion. NATO was, I think, the way in which NATO expansion was done was not always done very cleverly. In the 2000s, and trying to work out where and are we really committing to these countries or not? And I don't think the West has always thought very clearly about that. So I think Georgia is on the front lines of that issue. But I'd be surprised if in the current environment they felt confident about moving in. Aggressively. The Russians.
I think it's important to differentiate between personal sanctions and economic sanctions that hit the whole population, more or less. Personal sanctions, I think, make very much sense, and there's rather sometimes a bit of hypocritical reluctance of hitting against those people with power in the West have their business interests in common. When it comes to economic sanctions, they were rather, again, a home play for Putin because he could use them very, very strategically for his anti-Western propaganda. And in terms of Georgia, I was there also this summer. It's empty because the Russian tourists are not there. And that's kind of a bizarre step Putin take to abolish all the flights from Russia to Georgia this summer, basically punishing his own population who loved going there for their holidays and had lost their flights or had them rebooked into areas they had no interest in going to. So that's the kind of things that are completely odd. But if you ask China or Russia what is more dangerous, maybe Russia, because a weakening and struggling power can often lash out quite in dangerous ways, like, for example, ISIS disappearing and then organizing suicide attacks and things like that. So that's on the one hand, but on the other hand, I can't possibly see having any strength to expand very aggressively.
Okay.
They might much rather cause trouble in the Middle East, siding with Iran, with China, with Turkey, so sort of backdoor annoying Western powers.
Let's move on. There's another question here. I think this gentleman.
The words threats and challenges have been used in respect of both China and Russia. Shouldn't we also, perhaps primarily, see them as opportunities?
Good question. Thank you. Threats or opportunities?
Well, I think that's a really important point. There are opportunities. There were opportunities. It wasn't always the fault of the Russians that these opportunities were wasted in the 90s and early 2000s. But there are some points about Russian official behavior, specifically in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, which I think compel Western powers to say, thus far, no further. And even the Chinese were remarkably unsympathetic to the Russians about Crimea, because the whole idea of territorial revision is something that the Chinese are terrified of.
For the Tibetans.
So I can see what you're saying, because we say in the book, we've got to keep talking to the Russians. We've got to keep up cultural exchanges. There's got to be trade, but there has to be a point beyond which we do not go. We have to. Litvinenko was assassinated in 2006. The inquiry took place in 2016. Our government preferred to have the money that
That's right,
Elisabeth
absolutely.
was talking about
To turn a blind eye to this kind of thing.
in London to satisfying the request of Alexander Litvinenko's widow,
Absolutely.
that a proper investigation should take place. It took 10 years for that to happen. So the British government has to have a much, it's not just the Americans who are all over the place on Russia, it's the European powers too. Angela Merkel may have made many mistakes in her European strategy, but about one thing, in her many conversations with Vladimir Putin, she's been consistent and firm all the way down. You made a terrible mistake invading Crimea, and you're going to have to pay for it.
But just to pick up on your comment from another point of view, I mean, I think that both those countries, Russia and China, have a deep sense that their history has not been appreciated in our country and certainly not in the United States. You know, it is a constant complaint of Russians that the losses they involved in the Second World War have not been acknowledged. And of course, whenever we celebrate our finest hour and D-Day and things like that, there's a feeling, well, okay, 28 million Russians or whatever, a seventh of population. Same with China, this sense, you know, that the West ruled the world, but there is, for the Chinese, there is a long sense that, a deep sense that this, that was, the Western period was a blip in the long history of the Central Kingdom. And it at least, you know, behooves us to recognize that both of these are proud countries that we do have to live on the same planet with. Next question, anyway. We've got one over down the back there, sorry, and then your gentleman here. Yeah. Oh, I see. There's another one. Okay, right. Yeah.
This could be a completely wrong question for a literary festival, but Oliver Stone's Putin interviews, the portrayal of Putin, how honest do you think that he came across in that documentary?
Sorry? Anybody answer it.
I think that's a really good. I've looked at lots of political textbooks while writing my book, and I've found nobody who uses that extraordinary film. It's well worth using because Putin felt relaxed when being filmed by Oliver Stone because Oliver Stone was anti-American. And so even this trained ex-KGB operative, Vladimir Putin, let a lot of things away about his attitudes and his sort of gut feelings that he hasn't made public before. And I think everyone ought to use YouTube and get onto Oliver Stone's film.
Good.
Inadvertently, it's one of the best ways into the mind of Vladimir Putin.
Okay, I'll try and take, there was, I think, a lady there that was starting to, had her hand up, and then this gentleman here. And then I think we'll have to call it a day, but...
I have a question to each of the panelists. Is there a consensus whether Russia is a failed state or a superpower?
There we are. Failed state or superpower? One word answer?
Neither. Neither. Something different. It's quite hard to... an oligarchical, not even an authoritarian state. I mean, it's quite hard to... It's quite hard to
Elizabeth, do you have a
describe, isn't it?
thumbnail description?
It's quite hard to sum it up.
I second that.
I think it's an authoritarian kleptocracy.
Meaning robber barons, right?
Robber barons, and still a delightful shambles.
Yes, and delightful is important as well. This gentleman here.
I think this is for the whole panel. In light of the kind of likely push around the globe for renewable energy and Russians' reliance on oil and gas, do you think if there is a big push in the next couple of decades towards renewables, how that's going to affect Russia and its ability to wield power.
Good question for the future.
One thing
Renewables.
I would say is the intelligence services in Russia have long had this as one of their primary collection targets, is to understand the developments of alternative fuel sources in other countries and what they're doing, whether it's fracking, whether it's other things, because they know it has the potential to shift power and resources away from them. So they have been concerned about that for years, actually, about what it might mean.
But have they done much? I've never seen any much. I mean, they're lagging behind already now. They have a big issue about lagging so much behind in terms of shale gas and keeping up with more sophisticated processing in just simply the oil industry. So I can't see them keeping up at all.
Robert?
When Vladimir Putin wrote his doctoral dissertation, which of course he didn't write, one of the main themes was, if Russia is to be a successful power in the world, it has to get itself off being addicted to gas and oil export revenues. And I think we were all agreed this afternoon. Putin has had 20 years to do something about this.
And it has
20 years. I mean, Brezhnev was in power for 19 years. Stalin was in power more or less forever. Putin has had a very long time to do something decisive, and he hasn't.
He had the oil boom. He had the best cards in his hands, and he played them uselessly.
Short-term tactician, isn't he? More than a long-term strategist in that sense.
Okay, well, we've covered all sorts of things. There's much more to talk about. These three will be signing books over in the bookstore. Thank you so much for coming, and please thank our panelists.